Some of the biggest obstacles to collaboration happen completely invisibly, without our conscious awareness, and sometimes before we've even begun to work together. Those obstacles are based on our implicit unconscious biases and assumptions that show up as our beliefs about people and groups of people, and those beliefs allow us to separate ourselves from other people and create walls between us and them. Implicit and unconscious means that it is simply a part of the way that we see the world. We don't even realize it's there. We don't realize we're doing it. We carry a lot of assumptions about other people and groups of people with us all the time. When we meet people and work together and begin to hear their views, we often dig farther into our assumptions and beliefs, and we actually reinforce the stories that we may already be telling ourselves. As human beings, when we are faced with differences in the ways that we think, in the ways that we behave, in the things that we value, or when we're faced with the prospect of change, and we're afraid that something's going to be done to us or something's going to be taken from us, part of how we react is to create other. We begin to tell stories of who the others are. We assign characteristics to them. We stereotype. We vilify. We create caricatures of those on the other side, and we lose sight of the people behind the storied caricatures we create. We set ourselves up in these battles against them, right against wrong, good versus evil. Not long ago, I was facilitating a contentious public process related to a river management plan for a highly used section of a river in an urban area. A particularly hot summer and an enormous increase in popularity of the river as a spot for inner tubers created some strain on the community of river users. The inner tubers were beginning to be seen as a bit of a scourge on the community. At one public meeting, I separated people into groups based on user types: kayakers and playboaters, picnickers and waders, conservationists, the business community, inner tubers, trail users, etc. They were engaged in conversation about questions specific to their groups, and I was wandering around the room just making sure everyone was okay and they had what they needed and the discussion was flowing, when one man waved me over to his table. And he said something to me like, "I think tubers are a really important part of this discussion, but I don't see any tubers in this room." And I said, "Oh, they're here." He said, "Where?" And I pointed to the front of the room, to the table where there was a discussion dedicated to the desired experiences of inner tubers. And the man looked on in silence for a moment, and then he said, "They don't look like tubers." He had this whole picture in his mind, a stereotype based on assumptions. His imagined image of what those foes looked like didn't match the actual image of anyone in the room. They all looked too normal, too human, too far from the image he had constructed. One of our goals in collaborative processes should be to replace stereotypes with genuine understanding. And there are specific ways we can help facilitate that process of creating understanding and moving from other to we. We'll talk more about how we do that in a moment, but first let me give you another example of how the assumptions we make about each other get in the way of us being able to work together. One day I had a conversation with a highway engineer who was frustrated about the project he was working on, or more specifically, he was frustrated about the people he was working on this project with. Highway projects are complicated affairs with many different disciplines working together to produce the final outcome. In this instance, drainage engineers were working with their agency's environmental division to discuss design. My friend, the engineer, had a series of complaints about how badly the meetings between these two groups were going. He said of the environmental folks, "They are very difficult to work with. They don't understand what we do. They don't think before they speak. They don't come to the meeting with a plan. They want to solve problems with 10 or 15 people in the room. And they're watering down the ideas of some very competent engineers." And he had this whole series of preconceived ideas about the personalities and motivations of the people who worked in the environmental group. And I bet they also had some notions about the engineers. In fact, I bet if you took a few moments to think about the personality characteristics of engineers and the personality characteristics of the environmentalists, you'd be able to come up with something without even knowing the actual people, simply based on our preconceived notions and implicit assumptions. How might those assumptions get in the way of working together? What would happen if we put aside the assumptions of who people are and how they should behave? Let's go back for a moment to the river management planning process I talked about earlier. Early in that process, we conducted an online survey to begin to get a sense of what the issues were and what people's concerns were. And in that survey, people began to otherize, to distinguish other. They began to separate themselves from those they perceived as threats to the things that they cared about. They assigned characteristics, and they began telling stories about one another. Some of the words they used to describe each other were immodest, disrespectful, noisy, inconsiderate, repulsive, dangerous, selfish, inappropriate, foul-mouthed, unsafe, irritating, and rude. When we assign these kinds of characteristics to one another, when we vilify and dehumanize each other, that creates a really troubling path. Some of the worst atrocities in human history have had at their root this same kind of beginning, the creation of other. The creation of stories and assigning of characteristics and dehumanizing of people. While I'm not suggesting that a river management conflict is going to turn into a human atrocity, those same dehumanizing, otherizing behaviors certainly make it easier for people to insist on getting what they want and need in a community process or in a negotiation or in a collaborative effort, even if it means that the others don't get what they want and need. So how do we get to the other side of other? How do we create a space of we, where instead of squaring off against each other and fighting about who's right and who's wrong, or who's good and who's bad, or who gets what they want and who doesn't, how do we all turn and look at the problem or issue together? I think it's actually pretty simple, but maybe a little counterintuitive. I think a first step in getting people to move toward a more we orientation is to give them room to be self-interested. You won't be able to just argue someone out of their position. People need to be heard and feel like they've been understood before they can really open up to hearing other people and consider the possibilities of working together to find shared solutions. Once people feel heard and understood, they can then put their defenses down long enough to listen and understand the perspectives of other people. Now, it's important to remember that we're not trying to change people's minds. We're not trying to get them to take the position of the other side. All we're trying to do is to create a greater understanding of one another and what makes people tick. In each process or project or situation, what do all of the parties care about? What are their fears and concerns and hopes and desires? We just want people to hear and understand one another. Understanding unlocks compassion, and those two things unlock tremendous opportunities to be able to move beyond the stories we've told ourselves about each other and to truly be able to turn and look at a problem or a situation together and to find solutions that help to satisfy the interests of all sides. In closing, I'd like to reiterate a couple of thoughts. In collaborative projects and processes, one of our goals should be to replace stereotypes with genuine understanding, to get people to see each other as people again, and not just as the stories we've created and the assumptions we hold. We can help people shift from seeing each other as other to seeing themselves as we, people working together towards some collective vision, by bringing people together to share their interests and concerns, to hear and understand each other, and to stop focusing on fighting with one another and to turn and look at a problem or situation together.